The most powerful weapon of World War II was not a bomb. It was not a battleship. It was not a secret code or a new type of aircraft. It was a fuel hose strung between two ships in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the men who held that hose won the war. But no one ever learned their names. October 1944, somewhere in the Western Caroline Islands, 1,000 miles from the nearest city, 850 miles east of the Philippines, 1,300 miles south of Tokyo. Commodore Worrell Carter stood on the bridge of the destroyer tender USS Prairie and looked out across the lagoon of Ulithi Atoll. There was nothing here. A coral reef shaped like a rough oval, 20 miles long, 10 miles wide. Inside that reef, a sheltered lagoon with depths of 80 to 100 feet. Scattered along the reef's edge, more than 30 tiny islands, slivers of sand and palm trees, the largest barely half a square mile. 400 indigenous people lived on these islands. 3 Japanese soldiers had been found when the U.S. Army landed unopposed the month before. The enemy had abandoned Ulithi, judging it too remote, too small, too insignificant to bother defending. Carter had been given his orders. Convert this empty lagoon into a fully operational forward naval base, capable of servicing the largest fleet in history. The timeline was 30 days. Not a single dock, not a single warehouse, not a single fuel tank, just coral and seawater, and an impossible deadline. And Admiral Nimitz had a word for what Carter was about to build here. He called it his secret weapon. Not the atomic bomb, not the codebreakers, his supply squadron. Because Nimitz understood what almost no one else seemed to grasp. You can build the most powerful fleet in the history of the world. You can fill it with the best trained sailors, the most advanced aircraft, the most devastating weapons. But if that fleet has to stop fighting every 2 weeks to sail home for gas, it is not a weapon. It is a commuter. And across the Pacific, an entire empire was betting everything on the belief that the American fleet would have to commute. They were wrong, and that miscalculation would cost them the war. But to understand how, you have to go back 3 years. To a Sunday morning in Hawaii when the world changed and a quiet officer no one had ever heard of received the assignment of a lifetime. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, 7:48 in the morning. Rear Admiral William Calhoun was already at his desk when the first bomb hit. He was not a young man, 57 years old, grey hair, quiet eyes, the kind of officer who spent his days signing requisition forms and reviewing supply manifests, while other men planned battles. His title was Commander, Base Force, Pacific Fleet. In plain language, he was the man responsible for making sure every ship had enough fuel, enough food, enough ammunition to do its job. It was not a glamorous title. No one wrote newspaper articles about supply officers. But on that Sunday morning, as Japanese bombs turned the harbor into a furnace, as the battleship Arizona broke apart and sank with more than 1,000 men trapped inside, as black smoke rose so high it blotted out the sun, William Calhoun watched the entire foundation of American naval power in the Pacific collapse in less than 2 hours. 8 battleships, damaged or destroyed. Nearly 200 aircraft, gone. 2,403 Americans, dead. And somewhere in the chaos, as smoke rose over Pearl Harbor, and the fleet reeled from the attack, Calhoun understood something that very few people in that moment had the clarity to see. The battleships could be replaced. The aircraft could be rebuilt. But the problem facing the United States Navy was not about what it had lost. It was about distance. Pull back from Pearl Harbor. Pull back far enough, and you begin to understand the scale of what America was about to attempt. The Pacific Ocean covers 165 million square kilometers. It is larger than all the land on Earth combined. You could fit every continent, every country, every mountain range, every desert inside the Pacific, and still have room left over. From Pearl Harbor to Tokyo, the distance is roughly 6,200 kilometers. From San Francisco to Tokyo, more than 8,500. And between those 2 points lies the most empty, featureless expanse of water on the planet. Weeks of open ocean with nothing but waves and sky. Now imagine you are fighting a war across this void. Every bullet fired by an American sailor was manufactured in a factory on the American mainland. It was loaded onto a train, shipped to a port on the west coast, loaded onto a cargo vessel, carried thousands of miles across open water, transferred to a supply ship, then finally delivered to the warship that needed it. Every gallon of aviation fuel that kept a Hellcat fighter in the air followed the same chain. Every can of Spam that fed a 19-year-old gunner's mate. Every bandage. Every replacement engine part. Every drop of fresh water. The supply line was not a line at all. It was a chain stretched across the widest ocean on Earth. And every link in that chain was vulnerable to submarines, storms, and the simple mathematics of time and distance. This was the problem, not how to defeat the Japanese Navy in battle. American shipyards would eventually produce enough carriers, enough destroyers, enough submarines to overwhelm any fleet. The industrial capacity was there, the manpower was there, the will was there. The question was how to keep fighting across an ocean so vast that the act of resupply alone could take weeks. Every time a carrier task force expended its ammunition and burned through its fuel, it faced a brutal choice. Turn around. Steam back to Pearl Harbor, rearm, refuel, restock, steam back out. Round trip from the combat zone to Pearl Harbor and back 2 to 3 weeks. Minimum. And during those weeks, the task force was not fighting. It was just traveling. The Japanese knew this. They were counting on it. To understand why the Japanese believed they could win, you have to understand a single phrase. Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. For decades before Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy built its entire strategic doctrine around one idea. There would be one great naval battle, a single, massive clash of battleships and carriers, and whoever won that battle would win the war. Everything in the Japanese fleet was designed for this moment. The largest battleships ever constructed, the fastest torpedoes ever engineered, pilots trained to an almost inhuman level of skill, Yamato, Musashi, 72,000 tons each, guns that could hurl a shell weighing as much as a small car over 42 kilometers. These were not just warships. They were monuments to a philosophy, the belief that one perfect strike could end everything. And embedded within this philosophy was an assumption so deeply held that no one in the Japanese high command ever questioned it. The assumption was this: the American fleet would have to fight the way every fleet in history had always fought. Sail out, engage the enemy, sail back to port to resupply, sail out again, because that is how navies work. That is how navies have always worked. Ships carry a finite amount of fuel, a finite amount of ammunition, a finite amount of food. When those supplies run out, the ship must return to a base. There is no alternative. There has never been an alternative. The Japanese calculated that after any major engagement in the Western Pacific, the American fleet would need to withdraw thousands of miles to Pearl Harbor. This would give Japan weeks, sometimes a month, to regroup, repair, reinforce. The vast Pacific, in Japanese strategic thinking, was not their weakness. It was their shield. This assumption shaped everything. The timing of their offensives, the positioning of their defenses, the allocation of their resources. It was woven into every plan, every war game, every staff estimate produced by the Imperial Japanese Navy between 1941 and 1945, and it was wrong. But in early 1942, the United States had not yet built the vast mobile logistics system that would sustain its later Pacific offensives. Fueling at sea and other replenishment techniques already existed and had been developed before the war. The U.S. Navy had experimented with underway refueling as far back as 1899, and the oiler USS Momie had pioneered at sea fuel transfers during World War I. But these were small-scale exercises, proof of concept, not operational capability. No navy had ever attempted to sustain an entire fleet across an ocean using mobile logistics alone. What was needed now was not invention, but transformation, taking techniques that existed on paper and in limited practice, and scaling them into a system vast enough to support the largest naval campaign in history. And the man who would lead that transformation was the grey-haired supply officer who had just watched Pearl Harbor come under attack. In February 1942, Calhoun was promoted to Vice Admiral and named Commander, Service Force, Pacific Fleet. In military shorthand, ComServPac. The title still sounded bureaucratic, but Calhoun's new mandate was staggering in its scope. He was responsible for the entire logistical support of the Pacific Fleet. Every drop of fuel, every round of ammunition, every spare propeller shaft, every replacement radar tube, every tin of coffee, and every roll of toilet paper consumed by every ship and every sailor from Hawaii to the Western Pacific. And Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, made one thing clear. The old model would not work. The fleet could not keep shuttling back to Pearl Harbor after every operation. The distances were too great. The enemy was advancing too fast. The war would be lost in transit if nothing changed. Nimitz needed Calhoun to solve the unsolvable problem. Find a way to keep the fleet fighting without coming home. Calhoun was not a man who inspired dramatic stories. He did not give rousing speeches. He did not pace the bridge of a flagship under enemy fire. The sailors who served under him called him Uncle Billy, a nickname that said everything about the kind of leader he was. Steady, patient, methodical. The kind of man who could look at a spreadsheet of fuel consumption rates and see the shape of a strategy. He started with what he had, which was almost nothing. In 1941, the Navy's fleet of auxiliary vessels, the tankers, cargo ships, ammunition carriers, repair ships, and tenders that formed the backbone of any supply operation, was desperately inadequate. The United States had spent the pre-war years building warships, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, the weapons of war. What it had not built enough of were the ships that fed and sustained those weapons. Calhoun began requisitioning everything he could find. Civilian tankers were converted for naval use. Merchant cargo vessels were pressed into service. Repair ships were pulled from mothball fleets and rushed back into operation. It was improvisation on a vast scale, the logistical equivalent of building a bridge while you were already driving across it. But Calhoun understood something fundamental. Acquiring ships was only the first step. The real challenge was not the idea of sending supplies to ships at sea. The Navy already knew how to do that in limited fashion. The real challenge was expanding that principle into a large, coordinated service force capable of sustaining fleet operations across the entire Pacific. It meant standardizing procedures, training thousands of crews, building a distribution network that could track and deliver hundreds of categories of supply to hundreds of ships spread across millions of square miles of ocean, and doing all of it while the war was already underway. The concept at the heart of this effort was called underway replenishment, UNREP. A supply ship sails alongside a warship while both are moving. Lines are shot across the gap between them. Cables are rigged. Hoses are connected. And fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, mail, even replacement personnel are transferred from one ship to the other while both vessels steam forward at 12 knots. Straightforward in concept, terrifying in execution. Picture it. Two ships, each weighing tens of thousands of tons, running side by side through open ocean. The gap between them is 30 meters, sometimes less. Both ships are rising and falling on swells that can shift their relative positions by several meters in seconds. The cables connecting them are under enormous tension. If a cable snaps, it whips across the deck with enough force to cut a man in half. If a fuel hose ruptures, thousands of gallons of highly flammable liquid spray across both vessels. If the helmsman on either ship makes an error of even a few degrees, the ships collide, and a collision between two vessels of that size, at that speed, is not a fender bender. It is a catastrophe, and this had to be done not once, not as a demonstration, not as a peacetime exercise. It had to be done hundreds of times, in all sea conditions, in all weather, sometimes within range of enemy aircraft, sometimes at night. The men who performed these operations were not elite commandos. They were ordinary sailors, 19, 20, 21 years old. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, kids who had never seen the ocean before they enlisted, and they were expected to stand on a pitching deck, handling cables and hoses and cargo nets, performing work that required precision and nerve, while the steel wall of another ship loomed 30 meters away, rising and falling like a breathing thing. While Calhoun organized the system from Pearl Harbor, another officer was about to become the man who made it work in the field. Captain Worrell Reed Carter was 60 years old in 1944, a submariner by training, a logistics specialist by assignment, a man who, like Calhoun, had spent his career in the shadow of more famous officers. He had survived Pearl Harbor. He had served in the unglamorous world of naval supply and repair for decades. In January 1944, Carter was given command of a newly formed unit, Service Squadron 10. The name meant nothing to anyone outside the Navy. Service Squadron. It sounded like a typing pool. It sounded like the men who mopped floors and filed paperwork. But Nimitz called it his secret weapon. Because he understood what Calhoun understood, what Carter understood, that a fleet without fuel is not a fleet. It is a collection of very expensive rafts. Carter's mission was to make sure the American fleet never ran dry. And to do it, he was going to build something that had never existed at this scale, a forward operating base centered on floating repair, supply, and storage capacity, positioned thousands of miles from the nearest permanent naval port. The location was that atoll in the Carolines, Ulithi. The first ships of Service Squadron 10 began arriving in early October 1944. Not warships, not carriers or battleships or sleek destroyers. These were the ships that no war correspondent ever photographed, no newsreel ever featured, no schoolchild ever built a model of. Repair ships, destroyer tenders, floating dry docks, enormous U-shaped steel structures that could sink beneath a damaged vessel, cradle it in their arms, then pump out the water and rise, lifting the ship clear of the sea so that workers could access the hull below the waterline. Ammunition ships with reinforced magazines. Refrigerator ships packed with frozen meat and vegetables. water distillation barges that could turn seawater into drinking water, hospital ships painted white with red crosses on their stacks, tugboats, crane barges, fuel barges, and tanker after tanker, riding low in the water, their hulls heavy with millions of gallons of fuel oil and aviation gasoline. Carter's flagship, the Prairie, anchored first. Then the ammunition ship, Plymouth Victory. Then the repair ship, Cascade. Then dozens more, arriving in convoys from Eniwetok, from Manus. From Pearl Harbor, a steady stream of unglamorous vessels converging on an atoll that most of their crews had never heard of. The Seabees came with them, the 51st Naval Construction Battalion, roughly 800 men, who landed to build the shore facilities. But the Seabees were only part of the workforce. Thousands of additional specialists served aboard the tenders, repair ships, and floating dry docks already in the lagoon welders, ship fitters, electricians, riggers, pipe fitters, men whose workshops happened to float. Together, this combined force of construction battalions and shipboard technicians would transform Ulithi in a matter of weeks. Many of them were older than the average sailor, tradesmen in their 30s and 40s who had been building things their entire adult lives, plumbers from Philadelphia, ironworkers from Pittsburgh, electricians from Chicago, men who had built bridges and factories and skyscrapers in peacetime, and who now found themselves anchored above a coral reef in the middle of the Pacific, tasked with constructing the largest naval facility on Earth. They worked around the clock, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Pontoon piers were assembled sections of hollow steel pontoons filled with sand and gravel, then sunk into position along the reef edge. Guy ropes anchored them to dead men on shore. Iron rods driven into the coral held them in place. Within days, piers that could handle destroyer-sized vessels began extending out from the tiny islands like fingers reaching into the lagoon. On Falalop Island, the Seabees widened, lengthened, and improved the Japanese-built airfield that already existed when American forces occupied the atoll. On Azor, they built administrative facilities. On Mogmog, they established a recreation area because Carter understood that men who had been at sea for months needed somewhere to stand on solid ground, drink a beer, and remember what land felt like. And in the lagoon itself, the floating base took shape. Imagine looking down from high altitude. Below you, the turquoise oval of the lagoon, and filling that oval, hundreds of ships. Not scattered randomly, but organized into precise anchorage sectors. Fleet carriers in one area, battleships in another, cruisers here, destroyers there, and woven among them, the vessels of Service Squadron tend the tankers, the tenders, the repair ships, the floating warehouses positioned so that any warship could reach a supply vessel without crossing the entire anchorage. The floating dry docks, massive structures, some over 500 feet long, anchored at designated repair stations. A damaged destroyer could be guided into the dock, lifted clear of the water, and have hull plates cut away and replaced by welders working in shifts, all without the ship ever leaving the lagoon, and the supply chain feeding into this floating city. A constant stream of cargo ships and tankers arriving from the rear, from Eniwetok, from Guam, from Pearl Harbor, from the west coast. Each ship carrying a specific cargo: aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, bombs, torpedoes, 5-inch gun ammunition, 40mm shells, 20mm rounds, canned food, frozen food, medical supplies, replacement aircraft engines, radar components, mail. Carter's staff had developed a distribution system of remarkable sophistication. Incoming cargo was sorted and transferred to station ships' vessels that functioned as floating warehouses, each holding specific categories of supply. When a combat ship entered the lagoon for replenishment, it was directed to the appropriate station ships based on its specific needs. A carrier that needed aviation fuel and replacement aircraft went to one cluster. A destroyer that needed 5-inch ammunition and fresh provisions went to another. The turnaround time was extraordinary. A task group that entered Ulithi depleted fuel tanks nearly dry, magazines half empty, food stores running low could be fully restocked, minor battle damage repaired, crew rested, and back at sea within days. Not weeks, days. No naval base in history had ever operated at this speed, and much of Service Squadron 10's repair, supply, and storage capacity was afloat and could move forward with the fleet. The base also depended on shore facilities, the improved airfield on Falalop, administrative buildings, piers, recreation areas, but the heart of it, the repair ships and tenders and tankers and floating dry docks, could be uprooted and repositioned as the war advanced. It was not a port in the traditional sense. It was something new, a hybrid of floating and fixed infrastructure that could project logistical power thousands of miles from the American mainland. By March 1945, the numbers were almost beyond comprehension. 647 ships rode at anchor in the lagoon on March 13, and the number was still climbing. As the amphibious forces staging for the invasion of Okinawa gathered, the count peaked at 722. 722 ships. In a lagoon that 5 months earlier had held nothing but fish and coral, more ships than Pearl Harbor had ever held. More ships than any port in the continental United States. More ships than any naval facility anywhere on the planet, at any point in human history. The Japanese knew that Ulithi was an American fleet anchorage their forces had already attacked it. But they failed to neutralize it and did not fully appreciate the scale and effectiveness of the logistics system operating there. The sheer scope of what Carter had built, the ability to repair, rearm, and resupply an entire fleet without sending a single ship back to Pearl Harbor, was beyond what Japanese intelligence had estimated or Japanese strategy had accounted for. By late 1944, Japanese naval aviation had been shattered. The catastrophic losses at the Philippine Sea in June, over 300 carrier aircraft destroyed in a single day, had gutted the Imperial Navy's ability to conduct long-range reconnaissance. The few land-based aircraft that remained operational were concentrated on defending the home islands and the Philippines. Japanese submarines, once a potent reconnaissance tool, were being hunted and sunk at an accelerating rate, and Navy censorship kept the details hidden. The name Ulithi was classified. No reporter was allowed to mention it. No sailor was permitted to write it in a letter home. When news dispatches described the mighty fleet sailing to battle, they departed from a Pacific base. Just that, a Pacific base. Japanese planners knew that the Americans were using a growing network of forward anchorages and bases across the central and western Pacific Majuro, Eniwetok, the Marianas, and Ulithi itself. But they repeatedly underestimated how mobile service squadrons, forward bases, and replenishment at sea reduced the fleet's dependence on Pearl Harbor and compressed the time between major operations. They continued to calculate American response times based on assumptions rooted in an older model of naval warfare, a model in which fleets needed weeks between major operations to resupply and refit. Those calculations were wrong, and every plan built on those calculations was wrong. But if Japanese intelligence could not measure the system's full capability, nature had no such limitation. December 17, 1944. The Philippine Sea. 300 miles east of Luzon. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet Task Force 38 had been conducting airstrikes against Japanese airfields in the Philippines for days. The operational tempo had been relentless. The carriers and their escorts had been at sea for an extended period, and fuel levels on the smaller ships were dropping fast. The destroyers, in particular, were running dangerously low. Some had less than 15% of their fuel capacity remaining. Halsey ordered the fleet rendezvous with a fueling group tankers from Service Squadron 10 for underway replenishment. The weather had been deteriorating for 2 days. Scattered squalls, confused seas, barometric pressure that kept dropping in a way that made the meteorologists uneasy. But the weather forecasting capabilities of the Pacific Fleet in December 1944 were still primitive. There were too few weather stations, too few reconnaissance aircraft dedicated to meteorological observation, too many gaps in the data. What the forecasters did not fully grasp was that a tropical disturbance had been intensifying rapidly to the southeast. It was not yet a named storm. It did not appear on any chart as a major threat. But it was growing, feeding on the warm waters of the Philippine Sea, spinning tighter, drawing energy from the ocean surface, and moving northwest, directly toward the Third Fleet. The fueling operations on December 17 were a disaster before the storm even arrived. The seas were too rough. Fuel hoses connected and then immediately parted. Cables snapped under the strain. Ship after ship attempted to come alongside the tankers, and ship after ship was forced to break away as the swells threw the vessels apart. The destroyers that most desperately needed fuel were the ones least able to maintain station. Their light displacement made them bob and roll unpredictably, turning every approach to a tanker into a controlled collision. By the end of the day, most of the ships that needed fuel had not received it. Halsey rescheduled the replenishment for the next morning and ordered the fleet to move to a calmer area. But there was no calmer area, because overnight the tropical disturbance became Typhoon Cobra. December 18, 1944. Morning. The wind hit 100 knots, then 120, then higher. Sustained winds of 185 kilometers per hour, gusts reaching 225. The seas were beyond anything most of the men aboard those ships had ever experienced. Waves rose to heights of 70 feet, and more walls of grey-green water that towered over the destroyers crashed down on flight decks, tore aircraft from their moorings, and flung them into the sea. The ships rolled violently. 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees. At 70 degrees of roll, objects inside the ship that are not bolted down become projectiles. Lockers break free from bulkheads. Machinery shifts on its foundations. Men are thrown from their bunks and slammed against steel walls. At 70 degrees of roll, a ship is on the edge of capsizing. The destroyer USS Hull was small even by destroyer standards. Light displacement, narrow beam. Top-heavy from wartime modifications, additional weapons and equipment bolted onto her upper works that raised her center of gravity. She had been unable to refuel. Her tanks were nearly empty, which should have been an advantage in heavy seas, but in fact made her worse. Without the ballast of fuel in her double-bottom tanks, she was lighter, higher in the water, and far more vulnerable to the wind. Hull began rolling violently early on the morning of December 18. Her commanding officer fought to bring the ship's bow into the wind, to reduce the beam seas that were pushing her past her limits. But the wind shifted constantly. The seas came from every direction at once. The ship's steering became erratic as the rudder lost effectiveness in the confused seas. At approximately 11 in the morning, USS Hull rolled past the point of no return. She went over and did not come back. Men were thrown into the water as the ship capsized. Some managed to inflate life jackets. Some clung to wreckage. Most did not survive. The water temperature was warm. This was the tropics, but the seas were so violent that men were torn from whatever they held and dragged under by the waves. Of Hull's crew, 62 men survived. The rest, more than 200, were gone. Within hours, two more destroyers followed Hull into the deep. USS Monaghan, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, one of the few ships that had fought back on December 7 by ramming and depth-charging a Japanese midget submarine in the harbor, capsized and sank with nearly all hands. 6 survivors, 6 men out of a crew of more than 260. USS Spence, nearly out of fuel, riding so high in the water that the wind caught her hull like a sail, rolled over and went down. 24 survivors. Across the Third Fleet, the damage was staggering. 146 aircraft, destroyed, smashed against bulkheads, broken loose from tie-downs, swept overboard, or consumed by fires that broke out in hangar decks as aviation gasoline leaked from ruptured fuel lines. 27 ships damaged, 11 requiring major repair. The light carrier Monterey suffered a fire so severe that it burned through 3 compartments before damage control teams brought it under control. A young lieutenant aboard Monterey named Gerald Ford, a future president of the United States, nearly went overboard when the ship rolled, and he lost his footing on the flight deck, catching himself on a steel ridge at the deck's edge. Total casualties across the fleet, 790 dead. 790 Americans killed not by the Japanese, but by the Pacific Ocean itself. A court of inquiry convened at Ulithi on December 26 aboard the destroyer tender Cascade. Admiral Nimitz attended personally. The court determined that Halsey bore responsibility for keeping the fleet in the path of the storm, but stopped short of finding negligence. Nimitz issued a statement that would become one of the most quoted passages in American naval history. The time for taking all measures for a ship's safety is while still able to do so. Nothing is more dangerous than for a seaman to be grudging in taking precautions, lest they turn out to have been unnecessary. Safety at sea for 1,000 years has depended on exactly the opposite philosophy. Typhoon Cobra was not a failure of the UNREP system. The tankers had been in position, ready to refuel the fleet. What failed was the decision to attempt refueling in deteriorating weather, compounded by inadequate meteorological intelligence. But the storm exposed a truth that the men of the service force already knew. The logistics fleet was not invulnerable. The men who sailed the tankers and ammunition ships and repair vessels were not exempt from the violence of the Pacific. They sailed the same seas, faced the same storms, endured the same weeks and months away from home. And they did it in ships that were slower, less maneuverable, and in the case of the tankers and ammunition carriers, carrying cargoes that could transform a modest fire into a cataclysm. A tanker hit by a torpedo does not simply sink, it explodes. A ship loaded with 5-inch shells and aerial bombs does not merely go down, it detonates. The men of the service force lived with this knowledge every day. Every underway replenishment, every transfer of fuel and ammunition was conducted in the company of that awareness. And yet they did it, hundreds of times, in fair weather and foul, within range of enemy submarines and aircraft, because the fleet could not fight without them. The cost was not theoretical. On November 20, 1,944 weeks before Typhoon Cobra, a Japanese Chiton, a manned suicide torpedo, had penetrated the Ulithi anchorage and struck the fleet oiler USS Mississinewa. The torpedo hit the ship's fuel tanks. Mississinewa erupted in a fireball visible across the entire lagoon. 404,000 gallons of aviation gasoline and tens of thousands of barrels of fuel oil igniting in a column of flame that rose over 100 feet into the sky. 63 men were killed. The ship burned for hours before capsizing, her cargo turning the waters of the anchorage into a lake of fire. No one called those 63 men heroes. No one made a movie about them. They were tanker sailors. They died delivering fuel, and the fleet they fueled went on to fight. 3 months after Typhoon Cobra, Japan launched a major long-range kamikaze strike against Ulithi. The Cayton attack on Mississinewa the previous November had been the first blow. Now a far more ambitious operation was coming. March 11, 1945, late afternoon. Kanoya Air Base, southern Kyushu. 24 twin-engine Yokosuka P-1Y Ginga bombers, codenamed Francis by the Americans, sat on the tarmac, loaded and fueled. Each aircraft carried a single 1,700-pound bomb. None of the pilots expected to return. This was Operation Tan No. 2, a long-range kamikaze strike aimed directly at the fleet anchorage, an attempt to cripple the staging base before the expected American invasion of Okinawa. The mission was audacious to the point of near impossibility. The flight distance was approximately 1,300 miles each way, 10 hours in the air, much of it over open ocean with no navigational landmarks. The aircraft would arrive at night, which offered the advantage of surprise, but made it nearly impossible to identify specific targets in a darkened anchorage. The pilots were young. Most were in their 20s. They had been selected for the Azusa, Special Attack Unit Azusa, for the catalpa tree, whose wood was used in Shinto tradition to make a bow that wards off evil spirits. They understood that their mission was to die. The only question was whether their deaths would accomplish anything. They took off around 8 in the morning and turned south-southeast toward the open Pacific. Almost immediately, the mission began to fall apart. The P-1Y Ginga was a fast and capable aircraft, but it was temperamental. Engine problems forced several bombers to turn back shortly after takeoff. Others developed mechanical issues during the long overwater flight and were forced to ditch or divert to emergency fields. Navigation was a constant struggle. The vast, featureless ocean offered no reference points, and the rudimentary instruments aboard the aircraft could not provide the precision needed for a flight of this length. Squalls and cloud banks obscured the route. Aircraft became separated from their formations. Some flew off course and never found the target. Some ran out of fuel and went into the sea. Of the 24 aircraft that took off from Kanoya that morning, only 2 reached Ulithi. It was after 10 at night when the 2 surviving Ginga bombers arrived over the atoll. Below them, blacked out, but not entirely invisible, lay the most extraordinary concentration of naval power on the planet. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, hundreds of ships packed into a lagoon 20 miles long. Radar aboard the carrier USS Hancock detected the incoming aircraft at 68 miles. Night fighters were vectored to intercept, but the Japanese pilots had already begun their final descent, spiraling down from altitude in a maneuver that made them difficult to track. The first Ginga dove toward the anchorage. USS Randolph, an Essex-class carrier, 27,000 tons, one of the most powerful warships in the American fleet, was anchored in the lagoon. Her crew was relaxed. Many were in the hangar deck, watching a movie. The evening was warm. The war, for this brief moment, felt distant. The kamikaze struck Randolph in the stern, just below the flight deck. The 1,700-pound bomb detonated on impact. The explosion ripped through the aft section of the ship, Steel plate buckled and tore. A fireball erupted from the point of impact, lighting up the anchorage in a sudden violent orange. Debris, metal fragments, pieces of aircraft, unidentifiable wreckage rained down across the flight deck and into the water. 26 men were killed. 105 were wounded. The second Ginga crashed onto an access road on the small island of Sorlin, apparently mistaking the road and a nearby signal tower for a ship. Its crew died on impact. Several servicemen on the ground were injured by debris and burning fuel, but there were no additional deaths. In Tokyo, the Combined Fleet's Communications Service intercepted several plain-language American radio messages referencing an air raid on Ulithi. Admiral Toyoda was optimistic. Perhaps the attack had succeeded. Perhaps the American carriers had been destroyed or crippled. Perhaps this was the turning point. The next day, a C-6N Siyun reconnaissance aircraft from Truk flew over Ulithi and photographed the anchorage. All the carriers were still there. No fuel slick was visible on the water. No burning hulks. No signs of catastrophic damage. 24 aircraft, 22 lost for nothing. 2 that reached the target. 1 hit on a single carrier. But here is where the story turns. USS Randolph was badly damaged. The aft flight deck was torn open. Structural members were bent and cracked. Compartments below the impact point were wrecked. On any normal assessment, the ship would need to return to a major shipyard, Pearl Harbor, at minimum, possibly the West Coast, for repairs that could take months. Randolph did not return to Pearl Harbor. She did not leave Ulithi. The repair ship USS Jason, already stationed in the lagoon as part of Service Squadron 10, moved alongside Randolph within hours. Welders, ship fitters, and structural specialists swarmed aboard. Working in shifts around the clock, they cut away the damaged steel, fabricated replacement plates, welded new structural members into position, repaired electrical systems, patched ruptured fuel lines, and rebuilt the sections of the flight deck that had been destroyed. The work took approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks. For damage that would have required months in a conventional shipyard. In early April 1945, USS Randolph departed Ulithi under her own power, fully operational, flight deck intact, ready for combat. She sailed to join Task Force 58 off Okinawa, and when Admiral Mark Mitcher needed a new flagship after kamikaze attacks successively knocked out both USS Bunker Hill and USS Enterprise, he transferred his flag to Randolph. The ship that had been crippled by a kamikaze at Ulithi became the flagship of the fast carrier task force. This was the secret weapon. Not a ship, not a gun, not a bomb, a system, a system. A system that could take a 27,000-ton aircraft carrier with a hole blown through its stern and put it back in the fight in 3 weeks, without the ship ever leaving the forward area. No navy in history had ever been able to do this. The Japanese certainly could not. When a Japanese carrier was damaged, it had to limp back to the home islands, enter a shipyard already overwhelmed with work, and wait in line for repairs while American submarines prowled the waters in between. For the Americans, damage was an inconvenience. For the Japanese, damage was often permanent, and now the full weight of what Calhoun and Carter had built began to make itself felt across the entire Pacific. Consider the contrast. Japan's shrinking fuel supply increasingly restricted the Imperial Japanese Navy throughout the war. The Yamato, the most heavily armed battleship ever built, did see action in 1944, operating from Southeast Asian anchorages and fighting at both the Philippine Sea in June and Leyte Gulf in October. But the fuel crisis strangled Japanese naval operations with increasing severity. By early 1945, The situation was dire. American submarines had systematically destroyed Japan's tanker fleet. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were still producing, but the tankers carrying that oil to Japan were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. The greatest navy in Asia was being starved to death, not by enemy guns, but by empty fuel tanks. Japan had built the sword and forgotten the arm. America had built the arm first, then wrapped a fleet around it. Task Force 5815 fleet and light carriers, 8 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and their supporting vessels sorted from Ulithi in mid-March 1945 for the Okinawa campaign. It was the most powerful naval force ever assembled, and it would remain at sea continuously for nearly 3 months. During those months, Task Force 58 conducted sustained air operations against Okinawa and the Japanese home islands. It provided air cover for the amphibious landing force. It intercepted and destroyed the Yamato during her final suicidal sortie on April 7, and it absorbed wave after wave of kamikaze attacks, more than 1,900 individual kamikaze sorties over the course of the campaign. Ships were hit, ships were damaged, ships were set on fire. Men died, thousands of them, killed by the kamikazes that crashed into flight decks and superstructures and gun mounts with sickening regularity. But the fleet did not withdraw. It could not withdraw. The troops on Okinawa depended on its air cover, and it did not need to withdraw because the tankers and ammunition ships and repair vessels of the service force were right there, sailing to meet the task force at prearranged replenishment points, transferring fuel and bombs and shells and food and replacement aircraft and fresh pilots, patching damaged ships and sending them back into the line. The scale of replenishment could be enormous. On July 21 and 22, 1945, during operations against the Japanese home islands, more than 100 Third Fleet ships received about 379,000 barrels of fuel over 2 days, along with ammunition, provisions, aircraft, and replacement personnel. And operations like this happened again and again throughout the final months of the war. The Japanese commanders watched this with something that must have approached disbelief. Their entire strategic calculus, the calculation that the American fleet would exhaust itself, that it would be forced to retire, that the kamikazes would bleed it until it broke, was predicated on the assumption that ships cannot stay at sea indefinitely. But Task Force 58 stayed, day after day, week after week, absorbing punishment that would have sent any other fleet in history limping back to port. For the Japanese defenders, it must have felt like fighting an enemy that could not bleed. You hit it, and it healed. You burned it, and it regrew. You threw everything you had at it, and it simply refused to diminish. This was not courage, though there was courage in abundance. This was not firepower, though the firepower was overwhelming. This was logistics, tankers and welders and cargo nets and fuel hoses. The dullest possible instruments of war, wielded with a precision and a persistence that no amount of heroism on the Japanese side could overcome. August 1945. The war was over. The bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Emperor had spoken. The guns silent across the Pacific for the first time in nearly 4 years. And now came the questions. In the weeks and months following Japan's surrender, teams of American analysts fanned out across the defeated empire. They were part of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the USSBS, a massive effort to understand exactly how and why the war had been won. They interviewed Japanese military leaders, government officials, scientists, industrialists. They examined captured documents, They walked through the ruins of bombed cities and the gutted hulls of sunken warships. Among those interviewed were the surviving admirals and senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who had planned the battles, men who had given the orders, men who had watched from command centers and flagship bridges as their fleet was systematically dismantled across 4 years of war, and buried within hours of testimony spread across dozens of interviews. A pattern emerged. The Japanese had not understood the American supply system. Not partially, not imperfectly. They had fundamentally, structurally failed to grasp what the United States Navy had accomplished in the realm of logistics. The confessions came in fragments, a phrase here, an admission there. No single dramatic moment of revelation. Just the slow, uncomfortable accumulation of evidence that an entire naval establishment had gone to war against an opponent whose most decisive capability it had never fully identified. Japanese officers described how they had calculated American operational timelines based on the distances between known bases. They had estimated transit times. They had projected how long it would take the American fleet to rearm and sortie again. They had built their defensive plans around these projections, and the projections had been wrong. Every time. The American fleet arrived sooner than expected. It stayed longer than expected. It hit harder than expected. And when it was damaged, it recovered faster than expected. The Japanese had treated these discrepancies as anomalies at first, intelligence errors, lucky breaks for the Americans, temporary surges of effort that could not be sustained. But the anomalies kept accumulating. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the American carrier force had met Ozawa's attack with a density of anti-aircraft fire and fighter coverage that should not have been possible for a fleet operating so far from its nearest major base. At Leyte Gulf in October, the Americans had responded to the Shogo Plan with a speed and concentration of force that the Japanese staff had calculated was physically impossible. At Okinawa, the fleet had simply refused to leave. Each time, the explanation was the same. The Americans had found a way to project sustained combat power across thousands of miles of open ocean, without the long pauses between operations that every navy had always required. The sword had blinded them to the arm. There is a particular cruelty in learning the truth too late. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who had commanded the combined fleet during the final catastrophic year of the war, sat across from his American interrogators and answered their questions with the precise courtesy of a man who had nothing left to lose. He had ordered the Shogo operation at Leyte Gulf. He had authorized the kamikaze campaign. He had presided over the destruction of everything he had spent his career building. When asked about American logistics, Toyoda acknowledged what the record made undeniable. The Japanese had underestimated American sustainability at sea. They had not anticipated the scope of the replenishment system. They had planned for a war of decisive battles and found themselves in a war of sustained pressure, a war for which their fleet was not designed and their doctrine had no answer. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had led the mobile fleet at the Philippine Sea, was more specific. He had known his pilots were poorly trained. He had known his aircraft were increasingly outclassed. But he had believed that the distances involved in Pacific operations would impose natural pauses on the American advance pauses, during which Japan could regroup, retrain, rebuild. Those pauses never came. The American fleet did not pause. It kept coming, wave after wave, operation after operation, with a relentlessness that Ozawa had not believed any navy could sustain. The assumptions were not foolish. They were not the product of arrogance or ignorance. They were the product of centuries of naval experience. Every fleet in history had been tethered to its bases. The British Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen before 1941, operated from a global network of coaling stations and naval bases precisely because ships could not sustain themselves indefinitely at sea. The French, the Germans, the Italians, the Russians, every navy on Earth operated on the same principle. The Japanese had assumed the Americans would too, and for almost every navy that had ever sailed, that assumption would have been correct. But Calhoun and Carter had broken the pattern. Why do we remember the men who pulled the trigger and forget the men who loaded the gun? It is not a new question. It is as old as warfare itself. The cavalry charge is remembered. The quartermaster who fed the horses is not. The pilot who shoots down the enemy ace becomes a legend. The mechanic who kept the engine running is a footnote. We tell ourselves that this is natural. That combat is inherently more dramatic, more worthy of remembrance, and there is truth in that. The men who flew off carrier decks into walls of anti-aircraft fire, the men who stormed beaches under machine gun fire, their courage was real, their suffering was immense, and their stories deserve to be told. But the erasure of the logistics force from the popular memory of the Pacific War is not merely an oversight. It is a distortion. It creates a false picture of how the war was won, a picture in which victory was the product of courage and firepower alone, rather than the product of an integrated system in which courage and firepower were sustained by an invisible army of supply ships and repair crews and fuel handlers who made everything else possible. Calhoun understood this. Carter understood this. Nimitz, perhaps more than anyone, understood this. When he called Service Squadron 10 his secret weapon, he was not being modest. He was stating a fact. And now, 8 decades later, the system they built is still running. Every aircraft carrier strike group that sails from Norfolk or San Diego or Yokosuka today travels with its own logistics train. Replenishment oilers, ammunition ships, combat stores ships. The names have changed. The ships are larger, faster, more sophisticated. The techniques have been refined. Connected replenishment allows solid cargo to be transferred by cable between ships at sea. Vertical replenishment uses helicopters to shuttle supplies from ship to ship. But the principle is identical. The principle that Calhoun expanded into a fleet-wide system in 1942 and Carter implemented at the forward edge in 1944. The supplies go to the ships. The fleet never has to come home. The United States Navy is the only navy in the world that can sustain major combat operations indefinitely at any point on any ocean. Other nations are building carriers. Other nations maintain powerful fleets. But none of them can do what the U.S. Navy does: project sustained, continuous power across oceanic distances, because none of them have invested in the logistics infrastructure that makes it possible. That infrastructure is the direct descendant of what was built in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. The doctrine, the techniques, the organizational principles, it all traces back to Uncle Billy Calhoun's requisition forms and Worrall Carter's floating city at Ulithi. Commodore Worrall Reed Carter returned to the United States after the war. He was promoted to Rear Admiral. He wrote his book Beans, Bullets, and Black Oil, the story of fleet logistics afloat in the Pacific during World War II, published in 1953. It remains in print. It is still assigned reading at the Naval War College. It is a quietly extraordinary work, meticulous, thorough, and almost entirely unknown outside of professional military circles. Carter died on July 21, 1945. 975, at the age of 90. Vice Admiral William Lowndes Colquhoun retired in 1946. For 8 years, he lived quietly in Coronado, California. Then, on January 24, 1954, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the man who had won the Pacific War, flew from Berkeley to Coronado to personally deliver a commission promoting Calhoun to the rank of full admiral, retroactive to his wartime service. No ceremony, no press coverage, no crowd, just Nimitz, standing in Calhoun's home, handing him the document that recognized what he had done. Calhoun died on October 20, 1963. He is buried at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the ocean he had spent his career learning to cross. The Japanese admirals planned for the war they understood, a war of decisive battles, a war where the ocean was too wide for any fleet to cross without stopping. They were fighting the last war. The Americans were fighting the next one. And the men who made the difference, the men who turned the Pacific from an obstacle into a highway, never fired a shot. They loaded fuel hoses. They stacked ammunition. They welded steel plates onto broken ships at 2 in the morning. They sailed slow, fat tankers through submarine-infested waters. They stood on rolling decks in tropical storms and connected cables between ships that were 30 meters apart and closing. They were the fleet behind the fleet, the city that floated, the weapon no one could see, and they won the war.